Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very accomplished professional from California, USA, Sophie Jacobs. Sophie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Sophie is an ex-Buddhist monastic. She's an author, and all of you know that I'm very partial to authors. She's an author of a book titled The Intuition Experiment, and she's also an intuitive mindfulness coach. So, Sophie, before we talk about your book, I was fascinated when I was reading about you, about your incredible journey from being a Buddhist monastic to becoming an author to an intuitive mindfulness coach. Tell me about your journey.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I have to actually mention that the journey to becoming those things was actually inseparable from my journey to writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
So I must admit that in answering this question, I'm also going to go a little bit into my book. Um, a lot of the catalyst for the momentum of all of this started pretty much during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I was just about to graduate college, and I was largely in a relationship that I felt like at its core was off.
Mm-hmm.
I was waking up with throat tension every single day, and I was trying to explain that away and say, oh, it's this, it's that. But I was feeling a lot of suffering in my body, but I was living in my mind. And concurrently at the time, right when COVID hit and then I graduated college, I was given an opportunity to work at a startup that my friend had founded. So basically overnight, I became this startup leader doing operational work.
Right.
And that pushed my energy even further up just right here. So that really most of my time was spent, on the computer screen. But if I want to speak energetically to it, it spent all of it in my mind. And what I noticed was that I was giving myself a lot of justification and reason for why I was doing that certain job, why I was in that certain relationship. But at the level of the body, something felt discordant, something felt off, and that expressed itself in physical, energetic sensations. And basically toward the end of the summer in 2020, I started experiencing actual burnout symptoms. So it was like quite a quick progression into feeling burnout. And what I feel like was kind of I would like to describe like a synchronistic or a cosmic event happened where my house actually burned down.
Oh my God.
And I was experiencing burnout at the same time. So it was like this massive kind of explosion process of, okay, now I don't have a house. And the story around that I can get into a little bit. I was home alone. And I made what I felt like a gut decision, a intuition, you could call it, to leave my house.
Yeah.
And that single decision probably saved my life, because 3 hours later, my house was completely decimated.
Wow.
Completely decimated. And my neighbors didn't even have time to communicate to me. The fire department didn't have enough time to, communicate to the neighborhood. So in many ways, that single small decision ended up, I feel like, saving my life. And so with that knowing, it became clear to me, oh, there's something here. Some like life-affirming principle that I tuned into, that I listened into, that actually saved my life. And so how can I apply this to other areas of my life? And it became clear to me right after that process happened that I actually needed to quit my job, because at some deep fundamental level, this was not charging and sustaining my life force energy, what you could call it.
Wow.
And what felt actually like more expansive, or what I wanted to go toward, and I'll speak about this a little bit in terms of intuition, that pull was actually to focus on my spiritual life and I had been, a meditation practitioner, been really interested in Buddhism for quite a while, probably more than 10 years, maybe even my whole life.
Yeah.
So the momentum of that kind of carried, and
Amazing.
yeah, so I quit my relationship, quit my job, my house burned down. And so it was this whole kaleidoscopic force that brought me to the monastery. And then at the monastery with that training, what I ended up focusing on was really the Buddha talks about the Satipatthana Sutta, or the four foundations of mindfulness. And one of them is being the mindfulness of the body.
Wow.
So I really focused on that in my time at the monastery. And what I noticed was this question emerging, like, what does it mean to know something as true in my body? And so that actual question led me to write journal posts each and every day at the monastery.
Amazing.
The intuition experiment. So that is in many ways how this process evolved, and then naturally came toward wanting to work with people one-on-one and in group settings to help people with this.
It's almost as if you went through a rebirth while when you just decide to reinvent yourself. Fantastic. So Sophie, let me start by asking you a basic question for our viewers and listeners. How do you define intuition, and why do you believe it's an essential skill for personal and professional growth?
Yeah, it's such a fundamental question, right? And before I even define it, I want to actually mention that question in and of itself is a bit tricky when it comes to intuition.
Correct.
Because at its core, it is actually pointing to something that is quite undefinable. And so I'm not trying to give you a cop out of I'm not going to define this, but in some ways, I would just want to mention, when I'm saying these definitions, I'd actually ask for me, the viewer, to kind of tap into what it feels like when I say these things at the spirit, rather than get really caught up in actually trying to cage it and define it and mold it into a concept, because sometimes our striving to know something as a concept can get in the way of what it actually is.
Right.
So, but I will define it anyways in how I think of it. And I'm actually just going to read a little passage of my book. This is in the introduction. So essentially what I write is, my definition of knowing, intuition, has everything to do with connection.
Correct.
So when the energy of our awareness joins with the object of what we're observing, we form a connection. And that connection opens a channel between the observer and the observed. And so the deeper the connection, the clearer of channel of information. So, and then I go on to say that the energy of this information, it contains, the elements of wind, fire, water, earth, and they bring us closer to ourselves, our elemental selves. It's not an abstract knowing, apart from detached analysis. It's a deeply embodied one. So that's how I explain it in my book. But it's also, it's a form of guidance. So it's basically arriving at a sort of knowing without conscious reasoning. I mean, that's the most basic definition.
That's it.
And yeah.
So the follow-up question to that would be that what are some of the misconceptions a lot of people tend to have about intuition?
I feel like a lot of people, at least in American culture, tend to devalue the role of intuition as being something that's either pseudo intelligence or not to be trusted. This is largely, and I wrote about this a little bit in my book, this is largely coming from the Enlightenment age and Western philosophy and just like the course of like Western civilization, moving away from the belief in God toward the belief in rationality and skepticism. And while that has led us toward many, many amazing kind of insights and advancements in the realms of technology and beyond, what has ended up happening is that we've kind of severed other forms of knowing in celebration for the cognitive, the rational form of knowing. And there's been this narrative going on in starting from that era of, you know, rationality is kind of the highest form. And then these like base, you know, basal emotions should not be trusted. They're like animal instincts. And they're coming from a lower form of evolution. And so that narrative largely doesn't serve us anymore, because we live in such a complex world where we have to make these decisions that involve a lot of complexity. And because of that, we've kind of entered a point where we can't just rely on our logic anymore. And so I think that's a common misconception, is that intuition is just cannot be trusted. Now, we have to be quite discerning with our intuition and not always trust what's coming up in our emotions. So there's a level of skill and practice that we need to maintain, which is why the role of mindfulness is so important. But I think tossing the baby out with the bathwater, in a sense, is kind of like doing injustice to the amount of intelligence that we really have. And then another brief thing I'll mention that a lot of people have a misconception about is that intuition is going to like somehow magically enhance your life and give you the fantasy life that you've always been wanting. That is not, I mean, it definitely can bring you to really magical moments, but in a way, like intuition is not about your fantasy and not about your comfort. What I feel the deepest expression of intuition is liberation and freedom and spaciousness, and it's bringing you toward those energetic qualities. And sometimes that means sitting in your grief, you know, which might be an unpleasant experience, but in a way, it's an opening. It's a freedom. So I think that also we have to acknowledge sometimes our intuition takes us to places that mentally we don't want to go, but energetically it's expressing itself in an expansion.
Great response. And you also just mentioned mindfulness. So therefore, my next question I'm going to ask you on mindfulness. And that is there a connection between mindfulness and intuition? And if yes, how can mindfulness practices enhance our intuitive capabilities?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and something that I've been exploring a lot in my meditation practice. I absolutely believe that intuition is integral into this process. I like to think of it in two ways. One being that mindfulness kind of sets the foundation for intuition to arise. So I believe intuition is almost like this emergent property that comes from when we're able to quiet the mind and kind of listen in on the silence. And so that mindful property is kind of setting the tone to listen. It's developing the capacity to listen and to discern kind of what differentiates just like the noise, the narratives, the conditioning. It gives us the ability to really be awake and aware to what is actually going on in our hearts and our minds, because that's exactly where we discover and find our intuition. But then also, you know, mindfulness can serve kind of like a self-reinforcing kind of layer to this, in which when you do feel like, okay, I think this is my intuition speaking, you know, you can think of it like an experiment of like, okay, what would happen if I actually took the direction that you know, mindfully, I'm noticing this seems my intuition. Let me take that step in that direction. And then you can actually use your mindfulness to discern, okay, so now that I have taken that step, what has happened? Does this confirm or deny reality? Does this confirm or deny kind of like the energetic state of clarity, calm, expansiveness that underlies intuition? And so we both use it as a foundation and as a support for enhancing and trusting our skill set.
And do you think that there is a difference between intuition, fear, or wishful thinking?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it can be quite difficult to discern it, especially if we do not have a mindfulness practice, because the way that intuition expresses itself is largely in the body, in the sense doors. So the way I like to say it is that we've kind of valued our one sense door, which is our thinking. But there's all these other different sense doors and sense channels, which can give us information. And what happens is that, you know, our conditioning or like instinct can also happen in the body. So what we need to notice is when it comes to like fear, for example, what I often tell people is that, you know, I have them do this exercise actually, and I'm like, okay, if you're feeling fear, I want you to actually notice, does this fear feel like it's expanding you or it's contracting you? So that really tuning into the energetics of it and coming out of the stories of rumination that oftentimes like fear can produce. Because oftentimes what we'll notice if it's just fear is that it will get locked into stories around the fear and start using our thinking mind to kind of explain ourselves out of a situation. Often fear is trying to just protect us and keep us safe. But what we'll find with intuition is that it's not necessarily trying to keep us safe at the mind level, but it is trying to bring us into kind of freedom and spaciousness, which, you know, is it can be quite a different step that we take because it can be so uncertain, right? And then with wishful thinking, the one thing I'll say is that, you know, oftentimes when we have this wishful thinking, we have to constantly like reignite the narrative and the thought pattern that produces that fantasy or that wishful thinking. And there's some amount of like strain or energy that's involved in like constantly bringing that pattern up. And the thing about intuition is that it's actually when you let go of needing to come to a solution or an answer, or you let go of your attachment to that fantasy, you already know it's just there. You don't have to like produce it. You don't have to create it. You don't have to strain for it. That often happens when you're in a moment of wishful thinking.
Very interesting. And Sophie, tell me, you know, what are your thoughts on the intersection of science and intuition? And are there any studies or research that support the existence and power of intuition?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting question and something that I didn't necessarily like explore too much in my book, The Intuition Experiment, but I find it to be like quite a fascinating bridge. And what I'm finding is that there actually is a lot of science to support the influence of intuition. So let's say, for example, you know, in like American culture, like English vernacular, we say like we have this gut feeling, which is often like intuition. Well, the gut actually has a microbiome that actually has 100, you know, I think it's 100 trillion, billion, 100 billion, I believe, neurons that are lining the gut wall and that have, through the vagus nerve, a connection between the gut and the brain. Actually, 95% of our serotonin is created in the gut.
Correct.
Which is associated with mood. So when you increase your levels of serotonin, you decrease your levels of anxiety and depression, which are often associated with like, right, that fear, that contraction, that dimming of our life force. And what I find is really interesting is that practices of mindfulness and meditation have been associated with increased levels of serotonin, which is produced in the gut, which actually decreases our levels of those indicators of anxiety and depression. So I find there's something really actually like quite embodied about this that's revealed in the science. But on another level, you know, I was just reading this study. I think I'm trying to remember it talked about how the use of what they called non-conscious emotional reasoning, which basically means this emotional information that we're not consciously a part of, which is kind of one way of describing intuition, actually plays a role on our decision-making process in a valuable way if we also include analytical reasoning. So again, it's not to say like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but to say that in addition, with our analytical cognitive capabilities, including what sensory emotional information is coming through, being mindful of that, discerning what that is, and really understanding that there might be some sort of intelligence at play here. It has been found that our ability to make more accurate and more aligned decisions is enhanced with that.
Well said. And I have time for two more questions. So my next question is that, do you think intuition can enhance our relationships and social interactions? And if yes, how?
I do believe it can enhance our social interactions. There's a way in which intuition can kind of be like the truth meter in our relationships, in that it can really help us discern what kind of relationships and what kind of people are in alignment with what I would consider energy.
Right.
And so in many ways, relationships are an art form as much as they are kind of a practice and an equation. And the art form part of it, I think, blends this aspect of intuition.
Right.
In that sometimes we have this subtle sense that we just know someone is going to be our partner, or know something, our relationship is not going to work out. And I think that is a really valuable skill. I know I've talked to and interviewed a lot of, especially women, who've talked to me about encounters they've had with people, like on dates, for example. And I'm thinking especially to a friend who also wrote a book in my program, and she talked about this story that she mentioned in her book about how she had an interaction with someone where she felt like at a gut level was unsafe, but did not trust that, and then entered into an actual situation of unsafety. And so in many ways, we can both kind of get ourselves out of danger in situations, but also kind of either deepen our relationship, our capacity to relate with one another, or deepen our capacity to relate to ourselves and honor ourselves and what we need for ourselves, which only strengthens a relationship, even if we have to leave it.
Well
and
said.
so in that way, like, we do need to discern kind of at that point, is this just fear talking? Do I have, attachment wounding, relational trauma? And in that case, it's a more like complex and nuanced answer to the question, because we have to factor in those things.
Correct.
But at the heart of it, if we're really, trusting our intuition, grounded, understanding of our trauma and our attachment style, we might be able to kind of discern information that deepens our connection or deepens kind of our capacity to connect.
Well said. And my last question to you, Sophie, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing understanding of intuition, your book, The Intuition Experiment, and before I ask you the question, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Sophie Jacobs' book. I'm going to check it out myself. What would you say are a few tips that you could offer to be able to develop or improve our intuition?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's really important to start small and to experiment. So that's exactly what I did in my book. It's kind of the base of my book, is showing people that you do not have to like quit your job, end your relationship, make these like huge life decisions based on your intuition. You can start small. It can be as simple as like, does my body need water right now? Am I thirsty? Right? But beyond just that, there's a couple of tips that I like to give people. And one of them starts with the yes, no, maybe exercise. So this is something that I learned from Cory Muscara, who's a meditation teacher. And he talked about, developing a practice of what does a yes feel like in your body. So it's basically a mindfulness practice where you give yourself the word yes, you drop that into your system, and then you close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and notice what sensations arise as you feel into the yes. So what emotions, sensations, stories, and you write that down. Talk to a friend about it. You do the same thing with the no and the maybe. And then when you encounter a situation in which you have to make a decision of some sort, you kind of refer back to what information was gleaned from that exercise and see, does this match any one of those? And so we're starting to kind of feel at kind of an embodied level what a yes, no, maybe feels like, so that we can bring that forward into our decision making. And then sometimes a lot of times people run into situations where they feel fear on both sides. They have to make a decision, and there's fear from both sides. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but really the practice then would be to ground down, and to a lot of these practices that I'm going to give are very grounding. So that's kind of number one in terms of kind of developing our intuitive capacities, is to ground down. Then I would ask someone to really sit with one choice, visualize it, feel into the body. How does that feel to be with that choice? And notice what the physical sensations are, the energetic kind of imprint of that choice. Write it down. Go to the next choice and write it down, and then see, okay, compare. What is there a difference in this energy? Maybe we've coded it as fear, but is there an energetic kind of difference between the fear? And what I would say to that is, if the fear feels kind of like this opening into the unknown, that would more so resonate with your intuition. If the fear is like, I got to keep myself safe, that's more of a survival programming.
Interesting. And on that note, Sophie, and your amazing tips, I love what you said, which is the start small and experiment. And then you also talked about the yes, no, maybe exercise and your other tips. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for talking to me about intuition. Thank you for talking to me about your book, The Intuition Experiment. And thank you also for sharing with me so many different aspects to understand our intuition better. And I'm sure all our viewers and listeners will reach out for your book, will understand intuition, which actually seems to be so almost like a sixth sense, and yet you have developed it into a science. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate our conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.